once again, I want to welcome you and say thank you for joining us this weekend as we're continuing in a message series we've been in that we've been calling Southpaw, where over the past several weeks we've really been unpacking and looking at story after story of how we find God often doing some of his best work with his left hand. Because while God's right hand speaks of his blessing and speaks of his favor and speaks of his honor, it's God's left hand that speaks of those seasons and those times where maybe we feel left at a disadvantage, or left feeling defeated, or left feeling discouraged. Seasons that while nobody would ever choose to go through or choose to live through, how many of us, when we got to the other side of it, would be willing to testify that if not for some of those left-handed seasons of life, we might never have come to see the extent of God's right hand of blessing at work in our life. Especially when it comes to his grace and to his mercy, his calling, and even as we're going to discover today, even his goodness in our lives. His goodness in our lives, which naturally brings us to this guy right here. This guy right here, that's right. As what better way to highlight how God's goodness is often revealed most through those left-handed seasons of life than by taking a moment to highlight this right-handed NBA legend by the name of Brian Scalabrine, a.k.a. the White Mamba. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with the legend that is Brian Scalabrine, all you really need to know is that when it came to sort of his basketball skills and his basketball career, let's just say he was so good that not one team was able to hold on to him for very long. As Brian, during his 11-year career, found himself constantly being shipped to one team after the next, playing for teams like the Boston Celtics and the Chicago Bulls and the Nets, and ultimately retiring from the NBA in 2012, compiling a career average of catches 3.1 points, 2 rebounds, and 0.8 assists. And this is why I describe him as a legend. Because what made Brian Scalabrine a fan favorite even long after his playing days isn't because of the skills he had, but actually what seemed like he didn't have. Like safe to say, Brian Scalabrine, he didn't fit the prototypical sort of mold of the all-world athlete. But rather, when people would watch him, they saw a guy with a little bit of a gut, a guy who wasn't very fast, who maybe struggled in the hops arena, someone who the average guy could easily identify with. So much so that guys would watch him play and start to think, you know what, I think I'm as good as he is. Like, I could probably put up as many points and certainly as many as assists as he puts up. In fact, I actually remember watching Brian Scalabrine in the NBA and thinking to myself this very thing, some of these same thoughts. And here's the thing, apparently I wasn't alone in this sentiment. In fact, so much so that Brian Scalabrine, he'd heard all the talk. That, hey, I think I could take a guy like Brian Scalabrine. I think I could do just as much as he does on the NBA court. So much so that he partnered with a local radio station to come up with what came to be known as this competition known as the Scallenge. The Scallenge, where all these middle-aged guys whose ideal of a workout really typically consisted of getting out of the easy lounger and reaching for the remote, showed up to take him on this one-on-one, mano-a-mano basketball games. Now, any guesses of what you think happened? Yeah, that's right. They quickly discovered that Brian Scalabrine was a lot better than they thought, as he dominated and demolished every last one of them. And here's why I bring this up, is as we get into talking about the goodness of God, is that I found that sometimes you don't know how good someone is until faced with a challenge. Sometimes you don't know how good somebody is until faced with a challenge. Like, it's one thing to watch a guy like Brian Scalabrine play basketball on TV. But it was only when faced with a challenge that some of these guys come away realizing, you know what, he's better than I thought. In fact, it might help to explain why James, the brother of Jesus, says what he says in this passage we're going to look at today in James chapter 1. And in fact, maybe I would argue maybe the greatest kind of evidence or argument, if you will, for the lordship of Jesus that there is in the world is the testimony of James. As especially those of you who grew up with an older brother or sister, I mean, think about this. What would it take for you to believe that your older sibling was the Son of God? Well, I can tell you what it took for James to believe. It took Jesus literally rising from the dead. It's interesting enough, James isn't really anywhere to be found until after the resurrection. In other words, it took seeing Jesus go through some stuff. Go through the cross, go through being humiliated and cursed and falsely accused, only to come back to life after all that for James to realize just how good our God is. This moment of realization when he sees Jesus for who he really is, which is so much more than just some good teacher or a good prophet or some good guy. But we're talking about the Son of God, the Savior of the world. And so it's with this experience in mind and this truth in mind, he starts to, I believe, kind of reflect on some of the challenges in his own life. And especially the challenges of some of these believers in the early church who, what they were facing, what they were up against when he writes and pens these words in James chapter 1, starting at verse 2. He says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." Now, let's be real. Anybody ready to be done with James already? Like, come on, Pastor, can we just go to like Philippians? That seems like a happier book, a more positive book. Like, why do we got to be talking about trials and difficulties and struggles and certainly, consider pure joy? Like, come on. But check out what he goes on to say. He says, "Consider pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith, it's producing something." You're not just shadow boxing in the air, like it's producing something. It produces perseverance. And when we let that perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Blessed, goes on to say, "Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him." Listen, if you're taking notes, I originally wanted to call this message, "What the man in the arena knows that the cheap seat superstar never will," only to settle on something a little bit shorter and a little more descriptive of where we're going with this message this weekend by simply reminding you that it's in the trial. It's in the trial. The thing you lack, the thing you seek, the thing you're missing, listen, I believe for many of us is found in the trial. And look, I can tell some of you, you're not that excited just yet. My hope is that by the end of this, you will be a little bit more excited about where James is going with this. Check that out again. He says, "Consider pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." Now, to be clear here, James is not crazy. He's not a glutton for punishments. He's not the guy who smiles after getting punched. No, again, look at what he goes on to say. Why there's reason for this joy. He says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know the testing of your faith, it's producing something. It produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete and not lacking anything." In other words, you need to know there's some things in your life, even some promises of God for your life, that don't come without a fight. That don't come without a fight. But here's the good news with this. and what I love how James approaches it is that, look, when you're willing to persevere through it, when you're willing to go the distance in it, you can trust that there will be some joy on the other side. That there will be some growth on the other side. There will be some freedom and some victory in your life on the other side. Knowing that what you're fighting for, and this is why it's so important, you got to understand, knowing what you're fighting for, I do believe also determines how you fight. Why does James kind of talk about this and talk about what it produces? Is he doesn't want us to lose sight that listen, knowing what you're fighting for, it has a direct impact in how you fight. Think of it this way, like, let's be honest, if I was dropped into the middle of an octagon with some guy, Goliath-looking dude, in a UFC match, and someone told me that, hey, the grand prize of this battle is 75 cents, go for it. I mean, I'd be like, I'm tapping out. I'm done. You can have the 75 cents, keep it. But if you were to drop me in that same octagon, with that same opponent, and you said, hey, you're fighting for your family's freedom, you're fighting for your family's safety and security and for their future, I mean, you better believe I'd fight differently. I would scrap and I would claw. I would do whatever I had to do. In fact, one of my favorite speeches ever given is a speech that probably many of you have heard of before, at least parts of it, and it was given by Teddy Roosevelt. And actually, I referenced it right at the beginning, and it was a speech that was originally titled Citizens in the Republic, but now is just commonly referred to as the Man in the Arena. And in fact, here's just a short excerpt from this. It says, it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. Credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievements, and who at worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. I love that. But listen, long before Roosevelt penned these words, James was speaking of a similar truth here. That there's some things, there's some growth, there's some victory, there's some lessons gained that's only found when you step into the ring. That's only found when you're willing to persevere through some hard times. That's only found in the trials of many kinds in our life. Because in the words of James, the testing of your faith, it's producing something. It produces perseverance. That perseverance finishes its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And look, I think sometimes we can maybe hear a verse like that, where he's kind of talking about, of things to come. And we can almost kind of think he's just referring to some hopeful wish or promise down the road when it comes to eternity, something beyond this life. But James, when he's speaking of this, you need to know he's speaking of a present reality, a joy and a value and a wisdom, not just when it comes to eternity, but on this side of it as well. That on this side of eternity, there's some things in the trial that I receive. As again, what if? What if the thing that you lack in your life is in the trial? The thing that you lack for your marriage, it's in the trial. The thing that you need most or feel like you need most, the thing God wants to give you to make you more like Him, to make you who you were created to be, is in the trial. The growth He's trying to bring about, the faith and the confidence in Him He's trying to stretch and grow and expand in your life, it's in the trials you face. And it's important we see this because it's actually the context for everything else that James is about to say in the rest of this chapter and passage. Whereby understanding that everything that James says here in this passage has everything to do with the trials we face and persevering through those times. Look, when you understand that, it radically changes how we view the rest of the passage. Something you got to understand about James is James isn't flighty. He's very focused in his thoughts, right? He's not like some scattered storyteller. You got any of those in your life? Where all of a sudden they'll start talking sports, and next thing you know, you're in a political discussion, argument, like, how did we get here? That's not James. And so when he proceeds to go on and talk about topics like wisdom and wealth and temptation, these aren't just random thoughts. This isn't James just going off on some tangent or some rant. But it's a continuation of this conversation about how to receive from trials. But by not just living in them, but actually learning from them. Not just living in the setback or living in the disappointment, but how we can actually learn from it, grow from it, gain wisdom through it. As James continues on, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt. Because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. The person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Now, let's be honest here. If you pull that verse out of context, how many of you would say, man, it can almost kind of seem or come across like God's a little insensitive here. Like a little mean, like somehow he's holding out on us. Where if you doubt at all, sorry, hey, don't expect to receive anything from God. But here's the problem with that interpretation. And when we just pull it out of its context, is that the truth is, you can't have faith without some level of doubt. In fact, the opposite of faith is actually not doubt, it's actually certainty. It's actually certainty. But listen, not just that. Remember what he's talking about. He's not talking about your job or your relationship or that health situation you've been taking to God. No, he's talking specifically about wisdom. About wisdom and trying to highlight the fact that while a lot of us might pray for wisdom, the reason we struggle to receive it is because we're often looking for it in all the wrong places. Not realizing that wisdom is one of those things that's found in the trial. Let's think about this. What's the difference between knowledge and wisdom? Anyone know? Yeah, it's experience, right? Not a trick question. It's experience. It's going through some things. Because while you might be able to gain knowledge from reading through a book, you only gain wisdom by going through some things in your life. In fact, we see a great picture of this in a story Jesus shares in Matthew chapter 7. He says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine does not put them into practice, like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it came crashing down with a great crash. Now, important to know, why the man who builds on the solid ground is referred to as a wise man, and notice not just a knowledgeable man, or the only contractor they could find left in the town. No, he's described as wise because he didn't just get to this place overnight. The reason he understood the value of building on solid ground is because he'd built on some sand before. And because of this, understood the cost that comes when you try to build your life on anything other than Jesus. When you put your weight on and your faith into the wrong things. Where when I put, say, my weights of my expectations, right? Or the weight of my joy, or the weight of all my happiness, or the weight of all my goals and dreams on anything or anyone other than Jesus. Listen, not only do those things eventually collapse under the weight they were never designed to hold, but where the weight is placed gets crushed as well. In other words, if you put your weight on the wrong relationship, how many know you'll crush it? If you put your weight on the wrong ideal, you'll crush it. And listen, we know this, don't we? because some of us have experienced this firsthand. Where you entered into a relationship and you put all your faith and all your hopes into that person. You looked completely to this person to meet all your longings and all your fulfillment and all your desires and dreams in life. Only for the relationship to collapse under the weight of your unrealistic expectations. Because you put a weight on that person. You put a weight on that job. You put a weight on that 10-year plan that you had. A weight that they were never designed to hold, especially through the storms and the trials of this life. But not just that, because you also have your hope in that person, you also feel crushed in the process. As look, this story Jesus shares isn't just about faith, what we put our weight in. It's also about hope, what you're waiting on. This is why we say things like, I hope this works out well. I hope this interview goes well. I hope this relationship turns out how I want it to turn out. And here's why this distinction matters. Is that if you put your faith in the wrong thing, you'll crush it. But if you put your hope in the wrong thing, it will ultimately crush you. It will crush you. As in the past, whenever I read this parable, and preached from this parable, it always was been from the perspective of someone standing outside the house, just watching it, like watching a movie on TV, watching it crumble in the storm, when in reality, the foolish person we read of is in the house when it crumbles. Because people don't look at houses, we live in them. Especially back in that day. Like, this is long before HGTV and House Hunters and all those kind of, real estate websites. Like this is long before those things. And so while he put his faith in the wrong thing and crushed it, he was also crushed in the process. And listen, this is more than speculation, but we know this because this is a story that the disciples would have heard of before. Sometimes, let's be honest, when Jesus shares some of these stories, they can almost feel a little random. He's walking around with the disciples, they're going through the store, and he picks up like a bag of ice, and he's like, let me tell you a story of a wise man, and a storm, and rain, and all that. No, when he shared the story, there was an intentionality behind it. Because the moment he shared the story, they would have immediately drawn the connection to some words spoken in the book of Ezekiel. A story previously told through the prophet of Ezekiel. Listen, when these words are spoken, you got to understand this was a time when the Jewish people were under Babylonian captivity. They were often forced to leave their homes, to leave everything they knew, that they were familiar with, and taken to Babylon. And it's during this season. During this season, they didn't want to be going through. In a place they didn't want to be, but catch this, they would come to find that God was still working in. Even before Babylonian captivity, the Jewish people had long before this been slowly and steadily drifting away from God. And so here God is wanting to restore them and renew their relationship through this season, this chapter of their story, the Jewish people. As I've repeated this actually throughout the series, but it's so important we get in what certainly God already knew, and that's that sometimes it does take bad times to get us to a place that good times never could in our life. And so it's in this trial, we see these prophets, these false prophets show up on this scene, false teachers who come promising an easy out for God's people and telling them what they want to hear. Not what they need to hear, but what they want to hear. And what they wanted to hear was, hey, this will all be over soon. What they wanted to hear is, oh, God wouldn't ask you to go through any hard times or difficult times. Oh, what they wanted to hear is, oh, this won't last very long. Giving them false hope and empty promises around getting out of this instead of calling them to trust in our God who promises to get them through this. And so this is what sparks these words. This is God confronting these false prophets through the prophet Ezekiel, saying this in verse 10 of chapter 13. It says, you have led my people astray, saying, peace when there is no peace, and because when a flimsy wall is built, they cover it with whitewash. Therefore tell those who cover it with whitewash that it's all going to fall. Rain will come in torrents, and I will send the hailstones hurtling down, and violent winds will burst forth. When the wall collapses, will people not ask you, where is the whitewash you covered it with? Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, in my wrath I will unleash a violent wind, and in my anger hailstones and torrents of rain will fall with destructive fury. I will tear down the wall you have covered with whitewash, and will level to the ground so that its foundation will be laid bare. And then catch this, when it falls, you will be destroyed in it. Because again, certainly back then, you didn't just look at houses, you lived in them, right? And of course, we read that, and it can be easy to think, again, like, God, why are you so mad, right? Why make such a big deal about this? Because again, their hope, though, and why he gets, feels the need to confront these false prophets is because he's wanting to highlight that their hope was in the wrong place. It was a hope that was ultimately always going to let them down and collapse all around them. But not just that, God understands something we got to get, and that's when the storm comes. How many know it's a really bad time to figure out that your foundation is faulty? When the storm comes, it's really a bad time to figure out that what you built upon wasn't sturdy enough to begin with. As here's my issue with you, these false prophets. You're acting like paper mache is cinder block. You're acting like these things that just look nice are actually strong enough to hold you. And of course we hear that, and when we go, we think to ourselves, well, who would do that though, right? Like, who would build upon these empty promises by building upon sand? Like, why on earth would someone, when given the choice between building on solid ground and building on sand, choose sand? But think of it like this. Have you ever had someone come up to you and be like, oh, I'm so exhausted. I'm so tired. You know what I really need right now? I just need to get away, kick my shoes off. Let my feet just kind of sink in, right? Just sink in a little bit. Have some like gravel start running in between my toes and my feet. That's what I want. So it's like, wait, gravel? Yeah, that's what I want. I just want to dig my feet into some nice, solid rock and relax. To take that picture, put it on Instagram for the world to see my feet with all this gravel around. No, nobody says that, right? Because it doesn't feel as good. It doesn't feel as good as the sand. Like the sand feels good. The sand feels so much better. And so it's easy to be drawn to what feels good instead of what's actually good for us. Where if I can put it in more practical terms, we're way more comfortable talking about making changes in our life than actually living out the habits and spiritual disciplines that lead to that change coming to fruition in our life. We're often way more comfortable just talking about how the relationship is not where it needs to be than actually taking the steps to get help and counseling that actually leads to that relationship getting better. As getting back to when James is talking about and asking for this wisdom found in the trial, he says something that's really key to all this in verse 8. Is going back to verse 5. He starts it off with this, says, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all that they do. Now, this translation gets a little wonky on this right here, because we don't have a word in English that actually reflects what's being said here in verse 8 in the Greek. As what we often translate to mean as double-minded is not just a term in reference to your mind, but in reference to your will. As the original term in the Greek for this word is this Greek word, dipsychosis. Dipsychosis. So di meaning two, and psychosis is actually where we get the word psychology from. Point being is that what James is getting at here is much deeper than just don't be double-minded. Another little translation of this is this call to not be double-souled. S-O-U-L. Not be double-souled. Again, a term not simply in reference to your mind, but actually to your will. By calling out this tendency in all of us to often desire and pursue two completely different things in our life. Where in one sense we'll say we want growth, we'll say we want patience, but fail to receive it because we're unwilling to persevere through what it takes to develop it. As let's be honest, this is why I never pray for patience. Because I know God never just answers that prayer by instantly making me more patient. No, you know how he tends to answer that prayer in my life? By sending some heavenly sandpaper into my life. Giving me a sparring partner in that frustrating neighbor, or that intolerable boss, or all those summer vacationers who feel the need to go 15 miles per hour on Highway 101. Through practice and perseverance over time, enables me to develop the patience I so desperately need in my life. And so when James is talking about being a person, being double-souled, He's trying to caution us from living a life that's not actually going to lead you to the life you say that you want. Where we say we want wisdom, but we're unwilling to take the risk to develop it. We say we want to grow, but live a life that needs everything to go smooth and to not be bothered and to be comfortable. That kind of double-souled kind of life, James says, will always leave things on the table when it comes to what God desires for your life. By failing to see that the wisdom we say we want, the strength we say we want, the patience we say we want, it's developed in the trial. It's developed in the ring. It's developed in the fights. In fact, I dare say almost everything we want in life but don't have is on the other side of our comfort zone. It's on the other side of our comfort zone. As check this up, and we'll start to bring this to a close here. Verse 16 says, don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. In other words, what's he getting at here? Is that, listen, what if? What if that thing you lack, that joy that seems so evasive to you, that thing that's been evading you for so long that you've been praying to receive, the strength you've been praying for, the patience you've been praying for, the kindness you've been praying for, isn't found where you thought you had to look for it. Isn't found in a new thing. It's not found in the next thing or the newfangled thing or in the new trendy thing. But what if it's found in the trial? Well, what if it's found in the trial? Let me explain it like this. Oftentimes we'll order stuff from Amazon, and in one sense it's great because we'll get a notification when it arrives. But if there was a shortfall with this notification system, is that it doesn't always tell us where exactly it arrived. As anytime we get a package on our house, our house is basically on a hill, and there's no real defined front door. And as a result, it's always like an Easter egg hunt whenever a package is delivered. Sometimes the packages are at the front door, sometimes they're at the back door, sometimes they're in the mailbox, the garage. Sometimes, because they don't want to make the hike up the hill, they just drop it at the bottom of the hill. Now, a couple things about this. When we do finally track down the package and say it's sitting on the front steps, I don't assume that my front steps gave me the gift. Sorry, I don't take more care of you, that you're all chipped, you're in need of some fresh stain. No, why I found the gift on the steps. I know the location of the gift is not the same as the sender of the gift. They're different things. And here's why I bring this up, and because what happens oftentimes in our faith is we'll ask to receive something from God. So God, I need strength, I need patience, I need growth, I need wisdom, I need something to help me get through what I'm going through right now. And we ask God to give, and this is where the rub is for so many of us, and that's when we receive it from a place that isn't necessarily directly from Him. And so when it shows up in that difficult loss, or in that difficult financial situation, sometimes we don't know what to do with that. Sometimes we miss it, and if we're not careful, we can mistake the location for the sender. Well, I guess God must not be good, and God must not be kind, and God must just have it out for me, which might help to explain why James goes out of his way to remind us at the end of this. Again, in verse 17, hey, don't be deceived. It's not what it looks like. As you can trust that every good and perfect gift, it comes from God. Going on to say, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. In other words, because His heart never changes for you, you can trust that also means that neither do His plans and His purpose for you. Or to put it another way, if God cares for you, don't you think that God will take care of you? If God cares for you, don't you think that God will take care of you? And He isn't saying that. James is quick to remind us, hey, don't be deceived. Don't be surprised when the good and perfect gift He has for you is found in less than perfect situations. Found in the difficult job. Maybe found in the difficult relationship. And if we're not careful, the thing we've been avoiding or asking out of is the very thing that God is trying to use to make you whole and to make you complete. And if you sort of always just step back away from it, or just complain about it, or just live in it, rather than actually learn from it, you'll struggle to ever receive anything from it. And look, I just wonder if the reason some of you are tuning in today is because God's trying to get a notification sent to you to say, listen, especially in those times where maybe it feels like nothing's going your way. You ever been there? To remind us what really James is trying to get across to us through this passage is that the trial you face, that you feel like is disrupting your life and messing everything up, that you find yourself just struggling to get through, trying to remind us that you actually take from it more than it could ever take from you. Oh, come on, somebody. The thing that is interrupting your life where we're quick to go, God, get me out of this. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. He goes, no. It's not there to take you out, but rather it's there for you to pull some things from. As you've been given the rights and the authority to pillage what is dark. You've been given authority to rob from what seeks to rob from you. You're there to take from the trial more than it could ever take from you. Come on, somebody. I remember I came across this story as I was prepping this message of a Jeremy Renner. And he was in the news recently, literally in a life or death situation. And, after some months of just kind of recovery and going through some real tough times and some times of discouragement, some times of depression, he gets through all this. And he sits down, they do an interview with him, and they ask him, because, Jeremy Renner, he's kind of a well-known actor, has been in several movies, and so they were asking him about this experience. And so they asked him, like, how did you learn to walk again? And he goes, listen, just one step at a time, right? One step at a time. And then he goes on to say this. He goes that as I walked through this process, as I went through this trial and this hard time, he said, listen, I discovered that I've lost a lot of flesh and a lot of bone in this experience, but I've been refueled and refilled with both love and titanium. He went on to add to it. He goes, I used to just play like the role of like an X-Man, but I'm an X-Man now. And I love that is listen, that I could give you and leave you with any encouragement. It's that right there. Hey, that trial in your life, I'm not saying go looking for a fight. I'm not saying that maybe what you're going through you would ever choose to go through or ever want to go through again. I'm just trying to remind you that could it be that what you're going through, that the thing that you've been missing and searching for in your life, that missing peace, that missing joy, that missing patience, that missing maturity, that missing growth, could it be actually found in the last place you would expect to find it? Found in the trial. Found when you have the courage to step into the ring, to step into the good fight of faith. Look, I want to pray for you today. And again, I don't know what you're up against. I don't know what you're struggling with. I don't know what trials, man, you find yourself in. But if I can encourage you with this, is again to remind you that you're not shadow boxing. That all those pain and all those tears and that pain you're going through, it's not a wasted season. There are no wasted seasons to God. That he can actually take what the enemy meant for harm and turn it around and use it for your good. And take what, again, you would never wish to go through or hope to go through maybe ever again in your life, to develop some patience in you, to develop some growth in you, to develop some hope in you. By simply praying this prayer with me, if that's you, if you want to receive that today, just simply praying this prayer. Father, I recognize I've messed up more than a few times, but I believe you love me enough to leave heaven to come to earth, to die on a cross, to pay a price in full for all my sin, shame, past, present, future, and because of which, Jesus, I ask you to come into my life and to be Lord and Savior of my life today. In Jesus' name. Amen and amen.